We think women need to talk more openly about money because money really matters. It shouldn't be embarrassing or confusing. Join the conversation. We'll be discussing a whole range of topics which will help you get comfortable with your finances. Money Matters. Brought to you by AJ Bell.
Hello everyone, I'm Laura. Welcome back to the AJ Bell Money Matters podcast, which is not afraid to tackle those taboo money issues that can wreak havoc on your life. Isn't that right, Danny?
That is absolutely right. And money can be so divisive. It can be the start of a whole lot of disagreements with your significant other, especially if you let things fester.
And the one thing that we've heard from a lot of our Money Matters listeners, and what we've gleaned from a whole load of research that we've carried out over the past 4 years, is that money is hard to talk about. But it's even harder if you don't talk with your partner about it. If you don't have those conversations with your partner early on about money, it definitely gets trickier later on. In fact, we recently did a survey with the lovely folk at Opinium, and half of people said that they disagree with their partner about money, which is interestingly slightly more women said that than men. And the number is highest among younger people. So 57% of 18 to 34-year-olds said they'd had disagreements with their significant other about money versus 43% of those who are 55 or above.
Yes. Are you a spender or a saver? When do you feel that it's okay to splurge? And do you share the money decisions? Because it seems that whether or not you want to spend all your cash or you want to save a big chunk of your cash is the biggest cause of disagreement amongst both sexes. And Laura, I know that you love a spreadsheet. You've got all your savings ducks in a row, but if you couldn't splash out on a holiday, I can imagine that things in your household might get a bit tense. And wanting to spend more on holidays came in at number 2 on the list of areas for financial disagreement.
I can see why that is. I mean, holidays is probably one of the biggest kind of single expenses for people in a year. And so you can see how, A, the costs could really rack up, and B, people might have very different expectations of what their holiday levels are and what they're spending on it. Fortunately, I'm also married to someone who likes holidays and believes in spending money on holidays. In fact, sometimes I have to rein my husband in, which I think will shock regular listeners of this.
It shocked me.
Exactly. Think if there wasn't me reining us in, how insane it could get. So, but I can see how that becomes a kind of catalyst. I also think it depends what you're used to. You know, you might come to the relationship having had your family holidays being, you know, a week camping in the UK, and be getting together with someone who's used to a kind of 5-star all-inclusive cruise situation. And actually there's quite a lot of space between that in terms of your upbringing. So I can 100% see how that is a bit of a catalyst for arguing. But Danny, you've shared sometimes that you and your husband weren't always the best about communicating when it comes to money. Was that more when you were younger, or is it still now?
I think it still happens now, definitely. And funnily enough, holidays are, again, one of the biggest areas that we fight about. And my husband comes from a background where it was, a week camping in the UK when he was a kid, or the likes of Butlins, whereas I was incredibly lucky that we were able to go abroad quite often. So for me, a holiday a year without a holiday in the sun just feels so wrong. Whereas he's like, well,
agreed.
he says, no, we should have, a week in the UK and then, a week in the sunshine. So, particularly as we record this in February and it's chucking it down outside. That makes me rather antsy about the future for the year. But there we go. It is February, and that's the reason that we are talking about money and relationships. February, of course, home to Valentine's Day with all those proposals, or at least romantic dinners for two. But how do you start off on the right foot when it comes to a relationship?
Now, the bit that I found really interesting with my nerdy finance hat on is that in that research that we did, 18% of those surveyed disagreed on how to put away their money. So, for example, whether to invest in stocks and shares or to plump for cash. And I think having those different knowledge levels, different financial experience levels, but also different risk levels probably sums up a lot of the issues that people have when it comes to money and planning for the long term. And you can find all of the details about that survey in the podcast description. Thankfully, we don't have to have all the answers because we've enlisted the help of financial psychotherapist and author Vicky Reynal. Hi, Vicky. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, Vicky, I'm going to jump right in here because I am really excited about our conversation. We've heard from our survey that half of people cited money as the cause of disagreements in relationships. How often does that come up with the people that you talk to?
Well, money is one of the most common sources of conflict in romantic relationships. And depending on the study, it's either the leading cause or one of the leading causes of conflict, as you said. One study from 2023, it's a UK study, it showed that a quarter of people in relationships argue about money at least once a week. And even happy couples disagree about money more than any other topic that they disagree on. And the research also shows that couples who disagree about finances are significantly more likely to separate or divorce. So it's conflicts that have an impact on the relationship. So it's important to deal with them and pay attention to what is happening, because sometimes I find money conflicts are not really only about money, and there's a lot more to it that needs to be understood and unpacked.
I know Laura's going to ask a bit more about that, but I suppose for me, why is money such a trigger?
Well, I think it's a trigger because it's not just practical. Money can be very symbolic. We can use and misuse money to act out emotional issues. And sometimes those emotional issues belong to the relationship. So an argument, for example, about merging finances or merging accounts could be both about our different views on that topic, but it could also be about one partner fearing intimacy. And so merging too much means losing independence. And then the other partner being eager to have the reassurance that comes with a relationship that is progressing and things are getting merged and shared more. To give you another example, an argument about money secrets could be about that, but it could also be about different views on transparency versus privacy, also different sensitivities around trust and control. So I think there's a lot that money conflicts touch on, and that's why they become so emotional. But I think it's also because differences are inevitable, right? We're all really different in what we value, with our stance on what's too frugal, what's excessive, what's too risky, what isn't. So inevitably, we're going to come up against conflict in different areas. And generally, we're not really taught how to manage conflict. Sometimes it's modeled in families, and we have good examples of that, but not everybody does. And so we either mismanage conflict or we try to avoid it, which means that then money can come up when it's too late, too much resentment has built up, and it becomes a very emotional fight. So I think leaving it too late is one of the reasons why it becomes such a strong trigger. A lot has built up.
And it's not always easy, I think, for people in a couple to identify what the real argument is about. Is it about the money? Is it about how much someone spent, or, you know, their money habits? Or is it about something else? So is that a common thing that you see as well?
Yes. So it can be about a power struggle more than it can be about money. So I've seen couples who are arguing about how decisions, financial decisions are made, but underneath that narrative, there's also maybe what each person brings to that in terms of their own sense of entitlement. You know, are they entitled to have a stronger voice in the relationship for whatever reason? And so they use money in a way as an excuse to say, well, I make more money, so I should have a bigger say in this. Sometimes it's about the emotional needs that haven't been met. that can turn into a money argument, where I've seen, for example, you see it in romantic relationships, you also see it between parents and children. A child asking for more money could also be a way of saying, I want to be looked after more. I'm not ready to separate. And that can happen in romantic relationships where I've seen one of my clients kept complaining that the husband wasn't giving her enough money. And actually, they were a billionaire family, so clearly access to wealth wasn't the problem. She had access to all his cards. What emerged with time was how she felt he wasn't investing enough in the relationship. There were emotional needs that weren't met. So I think there's something that we're trying to communicate somehow through these money arguments that needs to be unpacked.
Yeah, and is there usually a kind of common reason why money becomes an issue between a couple, or is there many different reasons? I would imagine communication is one of the main reasons why it becomes a kind of trigger point for arguments.
Yeah, I think you're right. Not having communicated enough. Sometimes even when we start dating somebody, we ask them about their preference in terms of holidays or cuisines or even sexual positions. But money doesn't come up very early in the relationship. Sometimes because we're very ashamed that when the spotlight turns to us, what will it reveal? A lot of people carry a great deal of shame when it comes to how they manage their own finances. And so they avoid the topic so that they're not asked the question in return. So that's definitely something. But I think there's a few recurring arguments that I see. The one big umbrella one are the differences, as we were talking about, differences around how the money should be spent, how much should be saved, how debt should be handled, how much should be put away for a pension later on. So people have different preferences. They value different things, so they might spend money quite differently. They have different anxieties. And so that translates into different money behavior. And when those clash, couples often argue. The other big umbrella is how the decisions are made. Who has the power in the decision making? Are both partners feeling heard or at least consulted? Or is somebody going ahead and making choices that will impact both? I don't know, I've decided to retire, but that has an impact on the partner in terms of finances, lifestyle, and anxieties. Are these decisions made together, or are they made unilaterally? I would say those are the bigger ones.
The things that people can do in order to stop money issues becoming overwhelming, because it is still something of a taboo subject. It's not the kind of stuff that you tend to talk about with your mates down the pub in the same way that maybe you talk about your sex life.
I think communication is the key, but not just informing somebody of how you do things. I think there's a big difference between that and being genuinely curious about why your partner is a particular way about money. Why do they cling on to it so much? Is that something that used to be done in the family? Is it because maybe they grew up in scarcity and they've been taught and programmed to be careful with money? Or are there other reasons? And so I think curiosity is key, because to give you an example, one of my clients was talking about how irritated she was getting with her partner because he kept wasting money away on stationery. And all this money was just being spent on, these needless items. She didn't see any point for them and so on. And so they would argue about it every time he came back with, a few more, erasers or fancy pens. And I said, well, have you asked him why he's spending money on these things? And she said, well, I'm assuming he just likes them. And I'm like, well, ask. And what emerged were two things. One, that actually he had memories when he was young of going to the stationery shop and only be allowed to buy, the standard pencil, the minimum necessary, and then going to school. And that was because the family really couldn't afford to have more. And going to school, and all the classmates had all these fancy pens and pencils, and it was kind of a symbol of all that he couldn't afford and all of his friends could afford. And so it was a sensitive memory for him. But also what emerged is that he was quite depressed in his job in the present and in the here and now. And he was an architect, so he did work with stationery quite a bit. And actually during his lunch break, just this little trip to the shop was giving him a bit of a lift in his day. And just having that conversation, not only did it just make the problem go away, because she quite literally, at this point, realizing the bigger issue, she couldn't care less about the stationery. She wanted him to be happy and maybe find a new job or something like that. But yeah, it really shows how understanding can sometimes really help us either tolerate something that seemed irrational before, or find a compromise in which we both get a bit of what we want. So I think that's key. I think the other thing I often see is when couples argue, they tend to try to win the argument rather than maybe understand that there's always a pro and a con to different money attitudes. So that the typical example is a couple in which one is frugal and the other one spends quite easily. And when they argue, they tend to focus on, oh, I'm right because of this and you're wrong because of that. And there's two dimensions that get missed, and they are key to finding a compromise. And that's, what are the downsides of my approach to money? And what are the upsides of your approach to money? Because in a way, the frugal partner, who tends to take the moral high ground, look how well I'm doing, look how, I'm saving all this, can be secretly envious of how the other partner is enjoying their wealth more. They can indulge sometimes and have more fun with it. And vice versa, that the partner that spends more freely sometimes is quite envious of the control that the other partner can have sometimes in delaying gratification or putting money away for something bigger rather than spending it on all these smaller things. So I think sometimes we have to listen, but also be a bit more open to the downsides of what we do, or how we might be complicit in a dynamic that isn't working financially in the relationship.
You were saying earlier about learning from your parents about how to have disagreements about money. You were just talking there about people's experiences in childhood really informing how they think about money. But one thing that has changed is the way that couples now tend to both go out to work. So the blueprint of our lives, of a woman's place in the world, we don't really have anymore. And that means it can be quite difficult to figure out how to deal with some of these issues, particularly if, in certain cases, maybe the woman becomes the breadwinner and the man struggles with that.
It is a big problem, and it's recurring. I see it in a lot of men and women because the one thing that tends to happen is that women often blame men for the fact that they end up, both having to look after the household and the children, and now they have to work on top of it. But sometimes I invite women to think about whether they are complicit in that dynamic, and the fact that, they end up taking on more of that responsibility, maybe because at some level they feel they have to, or because at some level it's difficult to trust that the man will do as good a job because they haven't watched their father do it, or they don't have an imprint of a man modeling that kind of nurture and looking after the household and so on. So I think there is kind of what happens at a rational and conscious level. And then there's what happens unconsciously, in which we might be asking for one thing, but setting things up to quite not work that way for us. And so I think it's complicated because without the script, without the models, we might fall back into what's familiar rather than what's best and what we think is best.
And is it also quite tricky to identify when it's kind of a genuine money conflict in a relationship and when it's just your own baggage that you're bringing to it, or your own kind of hang-ups and issues? Because I think that requires a level of kind of self-reflection that not necessarily everyone has, right?
Yeah, you're right. It's not an easy thing to step outside ourselves and look at what we're doing. And I think one useful question to ask is, what role am I playing in this dynamic? Is this just them, or is it also something I'm doing? And one easy way to question that is to look at patterns. Is this what the relationship model that I always end up with? Has this happened in other relationships before? Because I'm the common denominator there. And so maybe there's something I do that invites this kind of whatever controlling behavior or whatever it is. When, for example, we feel like, in retrospect, if we're really honest, that we're overreacting to small issues around money, I think that points us to, something is really emotional for me here. I need to pay attention to it. I need to unpack it. And sometimes it is by observing our relationship with other people that we might see what's happening in our relationship here. So, am I always the victim, even in my relationship with my friends or my family? Or is it something that is only happening in my relationship with my partner? And that could point us to the fact that maybe it's us that is approaching things with a certain sensitivity all the time.
Is there a right time and a wrong time to try and deal with these issues, both in terms of at what point you start to talk about money and also when the conflict arises? Because it was interesting that our survey found that more younger people had disagreements about money than people 55 plus, perhaps because, some of those rough edges had already been worn away.
Well, I think the more you normalize talking about money in the relationship from early on, then the less likely you are to end up arguing about it. So I would start early. I think, and what I mean by starting early, I'm not saying disclosing the full picture of your finances on your first date, but already on the first date, you're picking up something from your partner. So attune to it. What are they doing about sharing the bill or not? You can be curious about that. There's no right or wrong, but be curious about, why do they prefer to pay? You'll watch them make a decision about how expensive the wine they order is. So there's a lot of, or what they do in terms of getting back home. What choices do they make with money? We make choices about money every day. And so when we're in a relationship, there will be a lot of signs early on. And rather than just ignoring them, we can be curious from the beginning, invite a conversation about it. I noticed you did that. I wonder why. Or, and that will help us then gather a lot of information and have a lot of more civilized conversations about money without letting it build up into just one moment of explosive conflict. Now, when the conflict does come up, it's always best not to talk about things in the heat of the moment. It's always good to let ourselves calm down and reflect a bit on what is it that they did that bothered us. And we can go back later and say, I felt anxious, upset, angry when you did that. Can you please help me understand why you did it? And I think it's so important that these conversations happen in private, not in front of other people. For a lot of people, money is an emotional topic. It is, there's a lot of shame attached to it. And actually what you might be opening up, as we were saying earlier, is not just a money fight. It could be about a lot more trust, intimacy, and other things. You really want to be having that conversation privately with them and not bring it up at a, Christmas dinner. And then be mindful. It's small things, but don't bring it up when they're about to fall asleep or walk out the door. Make sure you've created a space in which both people get a chance to talk and be heard, and then for it to be tackled properly and not just a throwaway comment that will just make people feel defensive or unsettled with no space to resolve it.
Vicky, that's been absolutely fascinating. And I know I, for one, am definitely guilty of flinging those last minute barbs as my husband walks through the door and just expecting him to find time to deal with it then and there.
We all do it.
Before we spoke today, I did get a chance to pore over your book, which is called Money on Your Mind. It's available at all the usual formats, online and in stores. Where else can people find you, Vicky?
I'm on LinkedIn and on Instagram, Vicky Reynal, Psychotherapy. And of course, if people have any questions as a result of this, I also write a column in the Times and the Sunday Times, and they're very welcome to email me their questions and I'll try to address them there.
Before we let you go, Vicky, this is Laura's favourite bit of the podcast. It is the bit where we ask all of our guests to share a financial confession or a dilemma that they have experienced personally.
So I think my confession is that I tend to treat small expenses and big expenses very differently. And it's actually a cognitive bias called a scale insensitivity, which means that you stop evaluating value proportionately as the numbers get large. So sometimes I fall trapped to that. I might get really frugal when it comes to choosing between two cereal brands. And then when it comes to adding an extra star to the hotel, I tend to become more impulsive and less thoughtful.
I can definitely relate to that. Sometimes I think, when you're hunting out for a bargain and you're trying to save £1 on something, sometimes I think, yes, but then, I just bought lunch yesterday and didn't think about it and spent way more on lunch. And so, yeah.
Exactly.
You get disproportionately hung up on things sometimes. So I think, yes.
Yeah.
And when you've got a lot of zeros on the end, what's one more, I suppose?
Oh, gosh. Yes. Wrong. That's just wrong.
Vicky, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. I'm sure our listeners will have got so much out of today's episode. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for your great questions.
Thanks, Vicky. And don't forget, you can find us on the new Women and Investing Hub on the main AJ Bell website. So that's ajbell.co.uk. The same great content that we've always had, but just in a new home. Let us know what you think. You can get in touch with us at hello@ajbellmoneymatters.co.uk.
And you can still find us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn at AJ Bell Money Matters. And of course, importantly, you can still sign up to our newsletter so that you don't miss a thing.
And that is everything for today. So thanks very much for listening, and we will catch you next time.
Before you go, please remember this podcast is for educational purposes, and the views expressed don't necessarily reflect those of AJ Bell. The podcast isn't telling you if a certain investment is suitable or not. Don't forget that the value of investments can change, and you can lose money as well as make it. It's also important to remember that how you're taxed will depend on your individual circumstances, and rules can change. The way an investment performed in the past may not be the same as how it behaves in the future. If you want help, go see a qualified financial advisor.